In the annals of history, certain names evoke a visceral reaction, names synonymous with power, cruelty, and an unyielding grip on a nation's fate. Saddam Hussein. Even today, the mere whisper of his name sends shivers down the spines of those who lived under his rule. A figure shrouded in both fear and awe, his story is one of ambition, brutality, and the devastating consequences of absolute power. Join us now as we delve into the life and times of Saddam Hussein, peeling back the layers of history to reveal the enigma behind the myth. Born into a world of poverty and instability, Saddam Hussein's early life was marked by hardship and loss. The turbulent political landscape of the 1950s Iraq provided fertile ground for his burgeoning ambition. A young Saddam, drawn to the revolutionary fervour of the Ba'ath Party, found purpose in their ideology of Arab nationalism and socialist reform. His rise through the ranks was swift, fueled by a combination of ruthlessness and cunning. Saddam, a quick study in the art of power, understood the importance of loyalty and the strategic use of fear. He surrounded himself with trusted allies, often drawn from his own clan, while systematically eliminating any perceived threats to his authority. By the late 1960s, Saddam had become a key figure in the Ba'ath Party. His influence, however, extended far beyond the party apparatus. He cultivated relationships with key military figures and established a vast network of informants, effectively tightening his grip on the levers of power. The stage was set for a dramatic power grab, one that would plunge Iraq into decades of authoritarian rule. The year 1979 marked a turning point in Saddam Hussein's trajectory. With the sudden resignation of President Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, Saddam seized the opportunity to consolidate his power. In a carefully orchestrated purge, he eliminated rivals and cemented his position as the undisputed leader of Iraq. Under Saddam's iron-fisted rule, Iraq underwent a period of rapid modernization and economic growth. Oil revenues, carefully managed and directed towards infrastructure projects and social programs, fueled a sense of national pride and progress. However, this outward facade of prosperity masked a darker reality. Saddam, deeply suspicious of dissent, established a pervasive security apparatus that permeated every aspect of Iraqi society. The Mukhabarat, his intelligence agency, became synonymous with fear and repression, silencing any voice that dared to challenge the regime. Torture, disappearances, and extrajudicial killings became commonplace as Saddam ruthlessly crushed any perceived threats to his authority. Drunk on power and driven by a potent mix of paranoia and megalomania, Saddam Hussein embarked on a series of disastrous foreign policy blunders. In 1980, he launched a costly and ultimately futile war against neighboring Iran, a conflict that would drag on for 8 long years. Fueled by a toxic brew of nationalism and a desire to establish regional dominance, the Iran-Iraq War devastated both nations. Millions perished in the senseless violence, leaving an enduring legacy of hatred and instability. Yet even as the bodies piled up, Saddam remained defiant, his grip on power seemingly unshaken. The international community, initially hesitant to intervene, watched in horror as the conflict raged on. Saddam's brutal tactics, including the use of chemical weapons against both Iranian troops and his own Kurdish population, drew widespread condemnation. The world was finally beginning to grasp the true nature of the regime they were dealing with. The year is 1937. The world teeters on the brink of war, and in a small village near the ancient city of Tikrit, a child is born. His name is Saddam Hussein al-Tikriti, and his early life is a tapestry woven from the threads of poverty, violence, and a thirst for power that would shape his destiny. Saddam never knew his father, a shepherd who disappeared before his birth. Raised by his impoverished mother and abusive stepfather, young Saddam experienced the harsh realities of rural life in pre-revolutionary Iraq. The deprivation and humiliation of his childhood left an indelible mark, fueling a deep-seated resentment and a burning desire to escape the cycle of poverty. Even as a young boy, Saddam displayed a volatile mix of charisma and cruelty. Stories abound of his penchant for bullying and petty theft, a foreshadowing of the ruthlessness that would later define his reign. Education offered a brief respite from the harsh realities of his life, but even within the classroom, Saddam's ambition and thirst for power were evident. As Saddam entered adolescence, the political landscape of Iraq was undergoing a seismic shift. The old order, dominated by the British-backed Hashemite monarchy, was crumbling under the weight of corruption and popular discontent. Nationalist sentiment, fueled by resentment towards foreign influence and a yearning for Arab unity, swept across the region. In 1957, at the age of 20, Saddam joined the Ba'ath Party, a nascent political movement that advocated for Arab nationalism, socialism, and the overthrow of the monarchy. The Ba'ath Party, with its intoxicating blend of revolutionary zeal and promises of a brighter future, provided an outlet for Saddam's ambition and a fertile ground for his burgeoning political aspirations. He quickly rose through the ranks, drawn to the party's militant wing and its clandestine operations. In the shadowy world of underground politics, Saddam honed his skills in propaganda, intimidation, and violence. His ruthlessness and unwavering loyalty to the party's cause did not go unnoticed. The year 1958 marked a turning point in both Iraq and Saddam's history. A bloody coup d'etat, led by General Abdul Karim Qasim, toppled the monarchy and ushered in a new era of instability and violence. The Ba'ath Party, initially supportive of the coup, soon found itself at odds with Qasim's regime. Saddam, deeply involved in the party's underground activities, participated in a failed assassination attempt against Qasim in 1959. Forced to flee to Syria, he spent the next 4 years in exile, further immersing himself in the Ba'athist ideology and plotting his return to power. Exile proved to be a formative experience for Saddam. He studied law, honed his political skills, and made valuable connections with other exiled Ba'athists. He also witnessed firsthand the brutal realities of power struggles within the Arab world, lessons he would later apply with chilling efficiency in his own rise to the top. In 1963, the Ba'ath Party, with the support of the Iraqi military, seized power in a bloody coup. Saddam, eager to reclaim his place in the party, returned to Iraq from exile. He was immediately appointed Deputy Secretary of the Regional Command, a position that placed him at the heart of the new regime. However, the Ba'ath Party's grip on power proved to be short-lived. Internal divisions and factionalism weakened the regime, and within months, a counter-coup led by Abdul Salam Arif ousted the Ba'athists from power. Saddam was imprisoned, subjected to torture and solitary confinement. Imprisonment, far from breaking his spirit, only seemed to harden his resolve. He used his time in captivity to study, strategize, and consolidate his power within the Ba'ath Party. He escaped from prison in 1966, further cementing his image as a cunning and ruthless operator within the party ranks. Following his escape from prison, Saddam played a key role in rebuilding the Ba'ath Party's clandestine networks and plotting their return to power. He understood that seizing control of the military would be crucial to their success. He worked tirelessly to cultivate relationships with key military officers, exploiting their ambitions and grievances against the ruling regime. In 1968, the Ba'ath Party, led by Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, once again seized power in a bloodless coup. Saddam, now a key figure in the party's leadership, was appointed Vice President and Deputy Chairman of the Revolutionary Command Council, effectively becoming the second most powerful man in Iraq. His rise to prominence was meteoric. He quickly established himself as the enforcer of the regime, ruthlessly crushing dissent and consolidating his control over the security apparatus. Saddam understood that power flowed from the barrel of a gun, and he was determined to build a security state that would ensure the Ba'ath Party's grip on power for generations to come. Saddam's ruthlessness was not merely a matter of political expediency, it was an intrinsic part of his personality. He believed that fear was the most effective tool for controlling the masses and maintaining order. Under his direction, Iraq descended into a nightmare of paranoia and repression. The Mukhabarat, Saddam's secret police, became synonymous with terror. They operated with impunity, arresting, torturing, and executing anyone suspected of opposing the regime. Disappearances became commonplace, leaving families in a perpetual state of fear and uncertainty. Saddam's paranoia extended even to his own inner circle. He routinely shuffled his cabinet, executed potential rivals, and surrounded himself with family members and trusted allies from his hometown of Tikrit. He understood that power, once attained, had to be guarded with an iron fist. As the 1970s progressed, Saddam's grip on power tightened, even as his paranoia grew. He saw enemies everywhere, both real and imagined. He increasingly relied on a small circle of advisors, many of them family members, to maintain control. In 1979, sensing a potential challenge to his authority, Saddam orchestrated a purge of the Ba'ath Party leadership. He accused his rivals of plotting a coup with the Syrian government, using fabricated evidence to justify a wave of arrests and executions. The purge, a carefully orchestrated display of brutality, sent shockwaves through the country and solidified Saddam's grip on power. He had eliminated his rivals, instilled fear in the hearts of potential challengers, and paved the way for his ascension to the presidency. With his enemies silenced and his power absolute, Saddam Hussein assumed the presidency of Iraq on July 16, 1979. It was the culmination of a decades-long quest for power, a journey marked by ambition, ruthlessness, and an unyielding belief in his own destiny. The world watched with a mixture of apprehension and fascination as Saddam consolidated his grip on power. He had transformed himself from a revolutionary street fighter into the undisputed dictator of Iraq, his name synonymous with both the promise of progress and the spectre of tyranny. His reign, marked by both periods of stability and unspeakable brutality, would have a profound impact on the Middle East and the world. The stage was set for a tumultuous chapter in history, one in which Saddam Hussein's ambitions would have devastating consequences for his country and the region. Saddam Hussein's ascent to the presidency marked a turning point in Iraq's history. Gone were the days of even a facade of collective leadership. Saddam, with ruthless efficiency, consolidated his grip on all levers of power, his paranoia fueling a reign of terror that would silence all opposition. He purged the Ba'ath Party, removing anyone deemed disloyal or insufficiently enthusiastic in their support. His vast network of informants, cultivated over years of clandestine operations, spread fear like wildfire, turning neighbor against neighbor, colleague against colleague. The Mukhabarat, Saddam's secret police, became the ultimate instrument of his will, operating with impunity, their presence felt in every corner of Iraqi society. Torture, once a tool of interrogation, became commonplace, a means of crushing dissent and instilling absolute obedience. Disappearances became a grimly routine occurrence. Individuals, snatched from their homes or workplaces, vanished into the labyrinthine depths of Saddam's prisons, their fates unknown to their loved ones. Fear, palpable and suffocating, permeated every aspect of life in Iraq. Beneath the iron fist, Saddam embarked on an ambitious program of modernization. Oil revenues transformed the face of Iraq. Schools, hospitals and universities sprang up across the country. Literacy rates soared, healthcare improved, and Iraq experienced relative prosperity. Saddam positioned himself as the architect of this newfound prosperity. But this facade of progress masked a darker reality. It was about consolidating his own power. And beneath the veneer of modernity, the machinery of repression hummed relentlessly. Saddam Hussein's image became ubiquitous, his face plastered on billboards, murals, and even school textbooks. He was the all-seeing father figure, the protector of the nation. State-controlled media churned out relentless propaganda, extolling his virtues. History was rewritten, his role exaggerated, rivals demonized. Schools became indoctrination centers, children taught to revere Saddam. This cult of personality instilled fear and unquestioning obedience. To challenge Saddam was to betray the nation itself. Despite the all-encompassing atmosphere of fear, whispers of dissent flickered in the shadows. In the mosques and universities, in the coffee houses and homes of ordinary Iraqis, resentment towards the regime simmered beneath the surface. The Kurdish minority in the north, long subjected to persecution and discrimination, yearned for autonomy. Their demands for self-rule met with brutal repression. Religious leaders, chafing under the regime's control, preached against the excesses of Saddam's rule, their words finding fertile ground among the devout. The regime's response was swift and merciless. Mass arrests, torture, and executions became the tools used to silence any hint of opposition. The Mukhabarat, operating on the flimsiest of evidence, rounded up anyone suspected of disloyalty, real or imagined. Fear, the regime's most potent weapon, was deployed with chilling efficiency. Neighbor was turned against neighbor, children encouraged to inform on their parents, the very fabric of society unraveling under the weight of suspicion and paranoia. In 1980, Saddam Hussein unleashed war upon Iran, driven by paranoia and ambition. The brutal Iran-Iraq war consumed the region for 8 long years. What he envisioned as a swift victory became a bloody stalemate, claiming over 1 million lives. The war's initial support soured as casualties and economic costs mounted. Saddam brooked no opposition, even as the war tore his country apart. As the war dragged on, Saddam resorted to increasingly desperate measures. He unleashed chemical weapons upon Iranian troops and his own Kurdish population. The town of Halabja became a symbol of the horrors inflicted by Saddam's regime. In March 1988, Iraqi warplanes blanketed the town with deadly nerve agents, killing an estimated 5,000 civilians. The images of the Halabja massacre shocked the conscience of humanity. The world was forced to confront the full horror of his regime. In 1988, after 8 years of devastating conflict and the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives, the Iran-Iraq war finally ground to a halt. The war, a costly and ultimately futile endeavor, left both countries economically and emotionally exhausted, the political landscape of the Middle East forever altered. Saddam, though weakened by the conflict, declared victory, his propaganda machine working overtime to spin the stalemate as a triumph for Iraqi arms. He had survived the war, his grip on power intact, but at a terrible cost. Iraq, saddled with crippling war debts and facing international condemnation for its use of chemical weapons, emerged from the conflict a pariah state, isolated and distrustful of its neighbors. The seeds of future conflict, sown in the blood-soaked soil of the Iran-Iraq war, were already beginning to sprout. The war, a defining moment in Saddam's reign, revealed both his strengths and his fatal flaws. He had displayed ruthlessness, cunning, and an unyielding determination to survive, but also a reckless disregard for human life and a dangerous tendency towards overreach. The end of the Iran-Iraq war did not bring peace to Iraq. Saddam, fueled by paranoia, tightened his grip on power, crushing any threats. The Kurdish population paid a terrible price for their perceived disloyalty. Accused of collaborating with Iran, they faced a brutal campaign of ethnic cleansing. Villages were razed, civilians executed, and thousands disappeared into Saddam's prisons. Chemical weapons were unleashed upon Kurdish villages, a testament to the regime's barbarity. The Anfal Campaign, a dark chapter in Iraq's history, showed the human cost of Saddam's rule. The year is 1990. Flush with a sense of invincibility after weathering the storm of the Iran-Iraq War, Saddam Hussein's ambitions spiraled to new heights. Iraq, burdened by war debts and facing international isolation, became a tinderbox of resentment, primed for a new conflict. Saddam, his ego inflated by years of unchallenged power, saw himself as the natural leader of the Arab world, a modern-day Saladin destined to restore the lost glory of the Ottoman Empire. His gaze fell upon Kuwait, a small, oil-rich nation on Iraq's southeastern border. Kuwait, a former Ottoman territory with historical ties to Iraq, became the target of Saddam's grandiose ambitions. He accused the Kuwaitis of stealing Iraqi oil, of conspiring with the West to undermine his regime, of failing to show proper respect for his authority. His accusations, a blend of historical revisionism and outright lies, resonated with a population weary of hardship and eager for a return to past glories. Fueled by a potent mix of nationalism and resentment, Iraq prepared for war, its sights set on the glittering prize of Kuwait's oil fields. On August 2, 1990, Saddam Hussein unleashed his forces upon Kuwait. Iraqi tanks rolled across the border, overwhelming the small Kuwaiti army in a matter of hours. The world watched in stunned disbelief as Saddam, with breathtaking audacity, redrew the map of the Middle East. The invasion of Kuwait, a blatant violation of international law, sent shockwaves through the global community. The United States, under the leadership of President George H.W. Bush, condemned the invasion and vowed to liberate Kuwait. The United Nations Security Council, united in its condemnation of Saddam's aggression, imposed crippling economic sanctions on Iraq and demanded the immediate and unconditional withdrawal of Iraqi forces from Kuwait. Saddam, however, remained defiant, his forces digging in along the Kuwaiti border. The world held its breath, bracing for a wider conflict. Saddam's gamble had paid off, at least in the short term. He had seized control of Kuwait's oil wealth and defied the international community, but his actions had also set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to his downfall. On January 17, 1991, Operation Desert Storm, a US-led coalition of over 30 countries, unleashed a devastating air campaign against Iraq. Night after night, the skies over Baghdad and other Iraqi cities lit up with the fiery trails of cruise missiles and bombs. Saddam, his boasts of fighting to the last man ringing hollow in the face of such overwhelming firepower, sought to rally the Arab world to his cause. He portrayed the conflict as a war against Islam, a desperate attempt to deflect blame and garner support from a skeptical Arab street. His propaganda, however, failed to resonate beyond a small core of supporters. The Arab world, largely united in its condemnation of the invasion of Kuwait, watched in dismay as Saddam's regime crumbled under the weight of the coalition's air power. The coalition's air campaign, relentless and precise, crippled Iraq's military infrastructure, communications networks, and command and control capabilities. Saddam, his forces reeling from the onslaught, resorted to desperate measures, launching Scud missiles at Israel in a futile attempt to provoke a wider conflict. On February 24, 1991, after weeks of relentless airstrikes, coalition ground forces launched a massive offensive into Kuwait. The ground war, dubbed by Saddam as the mother of all battles, proved to be a humiliating rout for the Iraqi army. Outmaneuvered, outgunned and demoralized by weeks of aerial bombardment, Iraqi forces put up little resistance. Thousands of Iraqi soldiers, many of them conscripts with little training or motivation, surrendered en masse, their dreams of victory dashed against the rocks of coalition military might. Within 100 hours, Kuwait was liberated, the Iraqi army crushed, and Saddam Hussein's dreams of regional dominance lay in ruins. The Gulf War, a decisive victory for the US-led coalition, had reshaped the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East. Saddam, though humiliated and weakened, had survived the conflict. He retreated to Baghdad, his grip on power shaken but intact, vowing revenge against his enemies and promising to rebuild his shattered army. In the aftermath of the Gulf War, Iraq became a nation under siege. The United Nations, determined to prevent Saddam Hussein from rebuilding his military capabilities, imposed strict economic sanctions on the country. The sanctions, while aimed at crippling Saddam's regime, had a devastating impact on the Iraqi people. Food and medicine became scarce. Hospitals struggled to cope with the influx of sick and malnourished children, and the once thriving Iraqi economy ground to a halt. Saddam, however, exploited the sanctions to his advantage. He blamed the West for the suffering of his people, portraying himself as a defiant leader standing up to imperialist aggression. He used his control of the black market to enrich himself and his cronies, while ordinary Iraqis struggled to survive. The sanctions, while intended to weaken Saddam's grip on power, had the unintended consequence of strengthening his hold over the Iraqi people. They fostered a climate of resentment towards the West, a sense of siege mentality that Saddam skillfully exploited to maintain his grip on power. Despite the crippling sanctions and international isolation, Saddam Hussein remained defiant. He refused to cooperate with UN weapons inspectors, claiming that Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction and accusing the West of fabricating evidence to justify regime change. His defiance, a calculated gamble aimed at preserving his regime, only served to deepen the international community's suspicions. The US, under the leadership of President Bill Clinton, launched a series of airstrikes against Iraqi military targets, citing Saddam's obstruction of UN weapons inspections. The airstrikes, while limited in scope, served as a stark reminder of Saddam's vulnerability and the ever-present threat of Western military action. They also fueled a sense of resentment among the Iraqi people, who bore the brunt of the economic sanctions and military strikes. Saddam, however, remained undeterred. He continued to defy the international community, playing a dangerous game of cat and mouse with UN weapons inspectors, and using his propaganda machine to portray himself as a victim of Western aggression. As the 1990s drew to a close, a palpable sense of fear and uncertainty hung over Iraq. Saddam Hussein, his regime weakened but not broken, tightened his grip on power, his paranoia and brutality reaching new heights. The Mukhabarat, Saddam's secret police, became ubiquitous, their presence felt in every corner of Iraqi society. Torture, once a tool of interrogation, became commonplace, a means of silencing dissent and instilling absolute obedience. Disappearances became a grimly routine occurrence. Individuals snatched from their homes or workplaces vanished into the labyrinthine depths of Saddam's prisons, their fates unknown to their loved ones. Fear, palpable and suffocating, permeated every aspect of life in Iraq. Saddam, increasingly isolated and distrustful of even his closest advisors, surrounded himself with family members and loyalists from his hometown of Tikrit. He ruled through a combination of fear, intimidation, and a carefully cultivated cult of personality, his image omnipresent, his word law. The world, weary of conflict and wary of becoming embroiled in another costly intervention in the Middle East, watched and waited. The spectre of Saddam Hussein, armed with chemical weapons and suspected of harboring ambitions to develop nuclear weapons, loomed large over the region. The international community, deeply divided over how to deal with Saddam Hussein, struggled to forge a united front. Some advocated for continued sanctions and containment, hoping to weaken Saddam's regime and force him to comply with UN resolutions. Others, however, argued that only regime change could remove the threat posed by Saddam Hussein. They pointed to his history of aggression, his defiance of international law, and his brutal treatment of his own people as evidence that he could not be trusted. The stage was set for a fateful confrontation, a clash of wills that would have profound consequences for the Middle East and the world. The world held its breath, wondering if and when the storm would break, and what the price of confronting Saddam Hussein would be. Under Saddam Hussein's regime, fear was a constant companion to the Iraqi people. It shaped their thoughts, words, and dreams. They navigated a world of shadows and whispers. The regime's eyes and ears were everywhere. Informants lurked in every corner of society. The Mukhabarat, Saddam's secret police, were synonymous with terror. Torture and extrajudicial killing were commonplace. Public dissent was rare, almost unheard of. The Iraqi people learned to wear masks, concealing their true thoughts and feelings. Despite the pervasive atmosphere of fear, resistance to Saddam Hussein's regime flickered in the shadows. In clandestine meetings, poetry and song, the Iraqi people found ways to challenge their oppressors. Student groups inspired by freedom met in secret, distributing leaflets and organizing protests. Religious leaders preached against Saddam's rule, offering hope in the darkness. Artists, writers, and musicians critiqued the regime with hidden messages. These acts of resistance were extraordinary courage in the face of oppression. They were a testament to the indomitable spirit of the Iraqi people. To maintain its grip on power, Saddam Hussein's regime constructed a vast and intricate machinery of repression, a system of surveillance, control, and brutality that permeated every aspect of Iraqi society. From the highest levels of government to the most humble of villages, the regime's presence was felt, its power absolute. At the heart of this system lay the Mukhabarat, Saddam's secret police, and its vast network of informants. The Mukhabarat operated with impunity, its agents empowered to arrest, detain, torture, and even execute individuals suspected of disloyalty to the regime. Prisons, notorious for their brutality and inhumane conditions, became places of unspeakable horror. Torture, both physical and psychological, was routinely used to extract confessions, punish dissent, and instill terror in the hearts of the population. Disappearances, often carried out in broad daylight, became a chillingly common occurrence. The regime's control extended far beyond the walls of its prisons. Censorship stifled freedom of expression, controlling what people read, watched, and listened to. Travel restrictions limited movement within and outside the country, isolating Iraq from the rest of the world. One of the most chilling aspects of Saddam Hussein's reign of terror was the systematic use of enforced disappearances. Individuals, often targeted for their political beliefs, ethnicity, or simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, vanished without a trace, leaving behind families shattered by grief and uncertainty. The disappearance followed a chillingly familiar pattern. Armed men, often dressed in plain clothes but easily identifiable as Mukhabarat agents, would arrive at an individual's home or workplace, bundling their victim into an unmarked car, their pleas for mercy ignored. Families, desperate for information about their loved ones, were met with silence. The authorities denied any knowledge of the disappearances, their pleas for information dismissed, their attempts to seek justice thwarted at every turn. The disappeared vanished into the labyrinthine depths of the regime's prisons, their fates unknown to their loved ones. Some were tortured and executed, their bodies dumped in mass graves that would not be discovered until after the fall of the regime. Others languished in prison for years, their physical and mental health broken by torture, isolation, and despair. The human cost of Saddam Hussein's reign of terror is immeasurable. Years of systematic repression, violence, and fear left deep scars on the psyche of the Iraqi people, scars that continue to shape their lives and their nation's future. The trauma of living under such oppressive rule manifested itself in countless ways. Widespread psychological problems, including post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety and depression, plagued a population struggling to come to terms with the horrors they had endured. Trust, a fundamental element of any healthy society, was shattered by years of suspicion and betrayal. Neighbors who once shared bread and laughter now eyed each other with suspicion, haunted by the knowledge that some among them had collaborated with the regime. The legacy of violence lived on in the countless families torn apart by disappearances, executions, and imprisonment. Children grew up without parents, spouses without partners, their lives forever marked by the loss and grief inflicted by the regime. The impact of Saddam Hussein's rule was particularly profound on the lives of Iraqi children. Born into a world defined by fear, indoctrination and violence, they were robbed of their innocence, their childhoods sacrificed on the altar of the regime's insatiable thirst for power. From a young age, children were subjected to a relentless campaign of indoctrination designed to mold them into loyal subjects of the regime. Schools became extensions of the state, their curriculum rewritten to glorify Saddam Hussein and demonize his enemies. Portraits of Saddam adorned classroom walls, his speeches broadcast over loudspeakers, his image omnipresent, a constant reminder of the children's supposed debt to their benevolent leader. Teachers, many of them coerced into becoming instruments of the regime's propaganda machine, taught children to revere Saddam, to inform on those who spoke out against him, to embrace the ideology of fear and obedience. Outside the classroom, children were exposed to the ever-present threat of violence. They witnessed the disappearances of neighbors and relatives, heard the screams of torture victims echoing from secret prisons, learned to navigate a world where fear was a constant companion. One of the most insidious legacies of Saddam Hussein's regime was the culture of silence it engendered. Years of living under the oppressive weight of fear and suspicion taught the Iraqi people to suppress their true thoughts and feelings, to conceal their pain and anger behind a mask of conformity. Silence became a survival mechanism, a way to avoid attracting the attention of the Mukhabarat, to protect oneself and one's family from the regime's wrath. People learned to avoid discussing politics, to steer clear of sensitive topics, to keep their true thoughts and feelings hidden deep within. This culture of silence extended even to the privacy of people's homes. Families, fearful of informants within their midst, often avoided discussing politics or expressing dissent, even within the supposed safety of their own walls. The weight of this silence, heavy and suffocating, had a profound impact on Iraqi society. It stifled open dialogue, hindered the development of trust, and created a climate of fear and suspicion that permeated every aspect of life. While the Iraqi people suffered under Saddam Hussein's oppressive rule, the world outside seemed indifferent. Governments, driven by strategic interests, turned a blind eye. Economic sanctions meant to weaken Saddam devastated the Iraqi people, worsening the humanitarian crisis. The world's inaction sent a clear message to Saddam Hussein that he could act with impunity. This failure to hold him accountable left a bitter legacy, shaping the relationship between the West and the Middle East to this day. The turn of the millennium cast a long, ominous shadow over Saddam's Iraq. The world, reeling from September 11th, turned its attention to the Middle East. Saddam Hussein, a pariah, was again at the center of global attention. The US, led by President Bush, accused Saddam of harboring weapons of mass destruction. The drums of war beat louder, echoing through the United Nations. Saddam responded with defiance and desperation. He clung to power as the walls closed in around him. The world watched as the US and its allies amassed a formidable force. The stage was set for a final confrontation, sealing Saddam's fate. March 20th, 2003. Operation Iraqi Freedom began with pre-dawn airstrikes over Baghdad. Saddam Hussein's days of power were numbered. The invasion exposed the hollowness of Saddam's regime. Saddam vanished into the streets of Baghdad. With the fall of Baghdad, Iraq descended into chaos. December 13th, 2003. The world watched in astonishment as images of a haggard, disheveled Saddam Hussein, his beard unkempt, his eyes flashing with defiance, were beamed across the globe. Captured by US forces hiding in a spider hole near his hometown of Tikrit, the once mighty dictator was now a prisoner, his fate in the hands of his enemies. His trial, a landmark event in international justice, began in October 2005. Accused of crimes against humanity, including the massacre of Kurds in Halabja, the brutal suppression of Shia uprisings, and the use of chemical weapons against his own people, Saddam used the courtroom as a platform to rail against his accusers and defend his legacy. The trial, though marred by accusations of political interference and procedural irregularities, offered a glimpse into the inner workings of Saddam's regime, exposing the brutality and depravity that had defined his rule. Witnesses, many of them survivors of his torture chambers and prisons, recounted harrowing tales of unimaginable suffering, their voices trembling with a mixture of fear and defiance. On November 5, 2006, Saddam Hussein was found guilty of crimes against humanity and sentenced to death by hanging. His execution on December 30, 2006, marked the end of an era in Iraqi history. Saddam Hussein's legacy is complex and contested. To his detractors, he was a ruthless dictator who ruled through fear and violence. Iraq continues to struggle to rebuild and heal from its troubled past. There have been countless movies made about Saddam Hussein. It has been speculated that there were no weapons of mass destruction. There are plenty of conspiracy theories as to why the former dictator was brought down. Despite the reason, his karmic retribution was overdue. Thank you for joining us as we explore the life of these notorious dictators. All images and videos were used in compliance with the Fair Use Act of 1976. This episode of Unveiling the Darkness, Saddam Hussein, is brought to you by Verum magazine. Written and directed by Kayleen Peoples, the editor-in-chief. If you enjoyed episode 3 of our docuseries, we would appreciate if you liked and subscribed. It helps our algorithm and further educates and informs viewers about the world in which we